Chapter 9 Towards the Near Future. Hey Sarah, mind if I join you? It was Lisa. Sarah was confused, but she didn't see anything wrong with it. However, John was speechless. Hey John, you don't mind, right? Sarah said, looking at John for his input, but John was struck with fear. Sarah had her attention on John, so she didn't even notice the way Lisa was staring at John. She was just standing there with an innocent smile on her face, just staring at John. Her dress swayed as she leaned in to see what John would say. She was wearing a fancy white dress with black slip-on shoes. To anyone else, this vibe seemed like nothing, but John felt like he was under a spell from her gaze. John? Sarah said, slapping her shoulder. John jumped. Yeah, of course she can join us. John hesitantly answered. Lisa held her skirt and plopped down between John and Sarah. So why aren't you guys outside like everyone else? Lisa said, moving her hair out of her eyes. Sarah thought about it for a moment and said, well, to be honest, I like to come here to read my comics and manga by myself. John is new around, and I'm hanging out with him now, so that's why he's here. Lisa nodded. I love to read comics and manga, but my father doesn't let me. Sarah frowned. Why not? Lisa opened her bag and pulled out a bunch of books. There were books about business and how to handle money. My dad wants me to take over the business one day, so he started me out early studying for the future. John was shocked that someone so young was already worrying about that kind of stuff. John watched his mother do her paperwork, and even she seemed like she could barely handle it. Sarah understood it because her family was kind of similar. My sister works me the same way, Sarah said. Maybe we should get together to study like a little powwow, Lisa said, half joking. I already offered to help John with all of his tests, so maybe so, Sarah said, opening her bag, pulling out manga. Here, you can read mine whenever your dad isn't around. Just try not to mess up the pages and to keep it clean. Lisa was surprised. She never had anyone outside of her family give her anything. Normally, it was always people trying to ask her for things or trying to get in her good graces to get in good with her father. Thanks, Sarah, Lisa said, smiling ear to ear. Her smile made Sarah smile brightly, and John slightly forgot his opinion of her before. No problem, Sarah began to speak, but suddenly Selena popped her head out of Mr. Daniels' class. Hey, Sarah, come here for a sec. Sarah sighed and put her bag to the side, and before she walked into the classroom, she turned to John and said, Hey, John, I'll be back. Do me a favor and take my bag for me. See you later, Lisa. Lisa smiled brightly and nodded. Thanks again, Sarah. Sarah waved and walked into the classroom. Now John was alone with Lisa. John was a little nervous being alone with Lisa, but he decided to just relax and to only speak if spoken to. Class will start soon. Today's gonna be lame since we got a test tomorrow, Lisa said. Suddenly she was very close to John, practically almost laying on him. John decided to remain composed. He just opened up Sarah's comic and began scanning through the pages. He didn't know what Lisa's game was, but he wasn't going to let her see him looking uncomfortable or out of tune. You mean all of that preparation, John said, just playing along and making conversation. Yeah, has Sarah already showed you her notes? John shook his head. No, she's actually going to do that today. Lisa was quiet for a moment. Would you like me to help you out a little? Lisa asked all of a sudden. John looked up from the comic Sarah had left. Really? Lisa smiled and nodded. Take out some paper. Lisa seemed excited. John took a notebook from his bag and got his pencil ready. Lisa showed him what the math and reading tests were focused on. After a while, the bell had finally rang, and students were starting to fill the hallway. Selena and Sarah came back eventually. Selena was rushing, probably still sleepy and still waking up. Okay, let's get the day started, Selena said, struggling to get the door open. She looked half dead. This made Sarah and John concerned, but they decided not to pry. You okay, Miss Adams? You look like you rolled out the wrong side of bed, Lisa said suddenly. John and Sarah were surprised, but Sarah was kind of happy that Lisa was the one to ask. I'm fine, just had an early morning, Selena said, finally getting the classroom door open. I hope I look as pretty as you one day. It makes sense that you wouldn't be yourself waking up so early, Lisa said. Selena scoffed. Trust me, I'm sure you'll be fine. Just never choose teaching as a career. Lisa and John laughed. Sarah just stood there quietly. She knew her sister better than anybody, and she knew Selena would tell Lisa to shut up if she could. Hey Lisa, did you get a chance to check out one of my books? Sarah pulled Lisa to the side. John started walking to his desk, but for some reason Selena called him over to her desk. John, I won't be counting tomorrow's test against your grade. Selena had focused on her computer, typing frantically. John was overjoyed. Really? It makes sense, but What made you decide that? Selena finally looked up from her computer. Well, to be honest, there is no point to you being tested right now. I'm more interested in finding out where you are. Selena winked at John. Listen, just relax and try to do what you know. John couldn't hide his smile any longer. He was smiling ear to ear, but then Selena snapped at him. Hey, don't slack on my test just because you're not getting graded. Keep in mind, whatever I feel you need to work on will be your homework to the next test. I know your mom personally now, so if I wanted to, I can make you study the way I do Sarah. John was nervous, but he quickly calmed down. When Selena wore that mischievous grin, in that moment he realized she had always planned to do that, since the very beginning. Now, young man, time to take your seat. Class is beginning, Selena said, standing up from her desk. It looked like she was finally awake and back to her usual hyperactive self. John nodded and started walking back to his seat. On the way there, he was passing by Ethan and Chris. Looks like John is even pulling teachers now, Ethan said, snickering and looking at Chris for his approval. However, Chris was just sitting there, looking at a comic, not paying him any mind. Ethan frowned. Hey Chris, did you hear me just now? John was up there spitting game to Miss Adams. Chris didn't look up from his comic. John was curious about what had happened. But since Ethan had his focus elsewhere now, he decided to continue back to his desk. Alright class, let's begin preparing for tomorrow's test. As you all know, John is new, so he'll only be doing a practice test. Selena looked over at John, which made the rest of the class look at him. Also, they were moaning and groaning. Oh, you're so lucky, one boy said. Can we trade tests, one of the girls said. I can help you study if you want, John, another girl said. John wished there was a wall around him, and he could see Sarah and Ethan and Lisa smirking at him. They obviously got enjoyment from watching him be so flustered. Sarah leaned over and nudged him. Look at Mr. Popular, John scoffed. They're just being nice. Sarah laughed. So modest. John rolled his eyes. Whatever. This made Sarah laugh. I guess Lisa was just being nice too, huh? John flinched, obviously starstruck of how observant Sarah was. But that begged another question. So if you knew, why did you leave me alone with her? Sarah started laughing harder. Because I knew it would be hilarious. John sighed. You and your sister are some demons. Sarah giggled. Speaking of which, she looked over at Selena. When John looked over at Selena, she was covering her mouth to hide her laughter. This made John pause. So wait, were y'all watching? John said. Sarah's reaction was all he needed. John shook his head. Damn demon children, he thought to himself. Sarah pinched him. Ow! John yelped, making the whole class turn around and look at him. Selena finally composed herself and reclaimed the attention of the class. Okay, class, enough chitter-chatter. Let's begin. Chapter 10. Front and Center. Selena spent the class going over notes for the math test for tomorrow. Before long, the bell rang, then she dismissed everybody. John was walking with Sarah to reading class, and Lisa was following closely behind them. I guess Miss Adams wasn't in the mood to play with the class today, John said, a little concerned. Sarah shook her head. She's fine. That's just how she is the next day after she overindulges. Lisa was confused since she wasn't present for last night's events. Miss Reed was waiting outside of her class. Like usual, she gave Sarah and John a high five, but today she put her hand out to Lisa. Lisa hesitated at first, but quickly high-fived Miss Reed, making Miss Reed smile cheerfully. They all walked into the class and sat at the desk in the back. Today, Lisa was sitting in the back between Sarah and John as usual. Sarah took out her notebook and let Lisa enter her and John's group chat. As soon as the students came into the class and began taking their seats, Miss Reed signaled for attentive silence. Okay, class, tomorrow's test on the last 3 chapters will be short. There will only be 10 questions to see who's paying attention, Miss Reed said, but her gaze stopped at Sarah, Lisa, and John in the back. While she was walking around reading, a notebook was being passed back and forth. They were making plans on how they were going to prepare for the test tomorrow. You both should just come to my house and study. I have a huge room and maids to serve us snacks and drinks, Lisa wrote in a notepad. Sarah and John looked over her shoulder to read, and Sarah wrote, That sounds awesome. Are you sure that would be okay with your dad? Lisa nodded and wrote, Well, of course, I'm a princess. John rolled his eyes. Lisa sometimes showed signs of her stuck-up personality. Sarah just snickered and wrote, How come such a wealthy girl is at a public school? Lisa grabbed a notepad and wrote, My dad thought I would learn more from being around regular kids. Sarah didn't get it, but John nodded and wrote, It's to give experience with the kind of people you have to sell your brand to in the future. Lisa smirked and nodded. You're pretty smart. I spent most of my life around wealthy and well established people, so Daddy thought it'd be good for me to learn from regular people about society. Plus, he says most private school kids are stuck up rich brats. John rolled his eyes. He couldn't believe he was hearing this from the self proclaimed princess, but he kept his comment to himself. Sarah and Lisa began conversing separately about the manga Sarah had lent Lisa. John decided to pay attention to Miss Reed reading a little. Hey, Chris. Psst, Chris. Ethan was whispering, trying to get Chris's attention, but Chris just kept his eyes on the book, following along with Miss Reed. Chris! Ethan began again, but was cut off. What? What do you want? Damn, shut the hell up. I'm trying to pay attention. Chris burst out, causing everyone to look at him. Miss Reed frowned. Chris, wait outside the classroom and read alone for a while. Chris frowned, but decided not to argue. He just grabbed his things and walked out of the classroom. The class began whispering amongst themselves, but Miss Reed signaled for silence. What happened between them? Lisa wrote in a notepad. John shook his head. I don't know exactly, but whatever it is, I guess those two won't be hanging out anymore. Lisa giggled and wrote, I'm not gonna lie, Chris is cool, but honestly, Ethan was riding his coattails and was kinda lame. Jared nodded in agreement. John sat there in his own world. He understood exactly what was going on, but he decided to mind his own business. The bell rang and class ended. Miss Reed closed her book and released the class to lunch, but she told Ethan to come and see her before leaving. The class began gossiping about Chris and Ethan. What do you think happened between Chris and Ethan? One guy said. I don't know exactly, but I bet Chris got tired of Ethan. He's so annoying, another girl said. John, Sarah, and Lisa walked out of the class while everyone else was having discourse. The hall was crowded as usual, and Chris had already left when they stepped in the hall. I guess they really aren't friends anymore, Sarah said, looking at John for his input. But John just nodded. Lisa nodded and said, honestly, it's probably for the best. Ethan is kind of childish. Sarah laughed. That's so mean. Lisa scoffed. You can still feel that way, as much trouble as he gives you? Sarah shook her head frantically. Don't get me wrong, I'm just saying it's probably best to mind our own business. Lisa scowled. You brought it up, right, John? John didn't say anything. He just walked along the hallway towards the lunchroom. Lisa frowned. She didn't appreciate being ignored, but she chose not to say anything else. They collected their tray and food, then went sat at the end of the table together. John saw Chris sitting by himself only a few seats up the table. He was eating and reading at the same time. John quickly looked away when Chris looked up at him. After that, he kept his attention locked on Sarah and Lisa, who were prattling on about manga. Suddenly, yo, you don't mind if I sit here? Ethan said, sitting down next to Sarah. Sarah became silent and looked uncomfortable. Lisa frowned and said, Ethan, go away. Nobody wants to sit with you, she barked. Ethan frowned. Shut up, dumbass. Nobody asked you. This made Lisa turn red. Who are you calling a dumbass, you stupid idiot? Lisa yelled, causing a scene in the cafeteria. John and Sarah hid their faces embarrassed from the attention they were drawing. Stupid idiot. Hi, is that the best you can do? Ethan laughed with food in his mouth. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't think you could comprehend big words, Lisa snarled. Ethan frowned and slang some food from his tray on her dress. Today they served spaghetti. Ew, gross. You're such a child, you dumbass mouth-breathing tool, Lisa said, standing up trying to get the stain out of her white dress. Ethan laughed and pointed. Out of nowhere, Ethan was on the floor holding his face. Chris had walked over and punched him in the face. But he hadn't stopped there. He put his knee on Ethan's chest and began punching him over and over again. Before long, the cafeteria monitors were pulling him off and carrying him out. Ethan was holding his face. When he stood up, he had bruises and his nose was bleeding. One of the cafeteria monitors walked him out to seek treatment. John and Sarah were shocked at the events that took place. They just sat there in disbelief. Are you okay, Lisa? Sarah asked. Lisa was too busy trying to scrub the stain out. Damn it! Lisa started turning red, and there were tears in her eyes. Lisa dashed out of the cafeteria with Sarah chasing after her. John sat there in a daze. Students began gossiping about what had just happened. Oh my God, I can't believe that just happened, one girl who was sitting with her friends had said. Chris beat Ethan's ass. I think he broke his nose. Some guy sitting down from them leaned in and said, I almost feel bad for Ethan. That went too far, another girl said. Nah, serves him right. We're always messing with people, another guy said. When lunch was over, Lisa and Sarah finally came back. Lisa's eyes were puffy from crying, and Sarah looked like she was crying too. Are you two okay? John asked out of concern. Lisa sniffled. Yeah, no thanks to you. John frowned, but didn't say anything. Hey, it's not his fault. John is new and kind of got dragged into my mess, Sarah said. Lisa scowled. You've been looking out for him. The least he could do is stand up for you when you're being picked on. Sarah stood quiet, unsure of what to say. John felt bad for Sarah, but he didn't like the fact that he was being lectured by Lisa. You're the one who provoked them, John said, standing to walk away. Sarah tried to stop him, but John snatched away. Nah, because I literally didn't ask for it. And if Little Miss Perfect here would have kept her mouth shut, it would have never went this far. John stopped because he didn't want to snap at Sarah, but then Lisa snapped back. Funny how the person who received no consequences at all is the one mad. Chris had nothing to do with it, yet he did something. John looked like he was about to pop a vein, but he was tired of fighting with Lisa, so he just walked away. Oh, look, he's walking away. No surprise from a coward. Lisa scoffed and pointed. John just put his hand up and waved and said, I don't have time to argue with a dumb bitch. Lisa began to chase after him, but was stopped by Sarah. However, Lisa wasn't done. She grabbed Ethan's open milk and threw it at the back of John's head. The milk spilled all over John. It was on his clothes and in his hair. The cafeteria gasped as they looked over at John. John gasped as the milk dripped down his neck. He turned around and started to throw something back, but when he looked at Sarah's sorry expression, he stopped, turned around, and left. When they went to Selena's class, John sat at the front of the class. This made Sarah sad, but Lisa pulled her to the back and distracted her with manga. Selena was concerned, but she had to address the cafeteria situation. The phone rang, and it was Lisa's dad calling her to the office to gather her change of clothes. When the bell rang, Selena called John over to talk to her. John hesitated, but he walked over to her desk. The back of his clothes were still wet from milk, but John didn't want to bother his mother, so he just endured it. John, what happened? Selena asked, grabbing John's hand and pulling him closer. But John didn't say anything. He just stood there silent. Selena looked at John's collar, and this made her gasp. John, what happened in the cafeteria? I need you to answer me. John stood there for a moment, but finally began to speak. I was clumsy, and I spilled milk on myself. Selena had a concerned look on her face, but she didn't know what to say. The way John was looking at her was that of a stranger. May I go now, miss? John asked politely. Selena looked at him, but decided not to pry any further. Okay, John, just know I'm always here, Selena said. John just nodded and began walking away, but Selena stopped him. Hey, John, wait. She went in her desk, then pulled out a shirt and a pair of gym shorts. Selena stood from her desk, walked around, and kneeled down in front of John, then hugged him. Don't shut us out. John didn't say anything. Selena held him for a minute, and just when he was about to pull away, he heard her sniffle. His eyes grew wide. When Selena finally let go, she wiped her face and put up a smile. Be safe getting home, okay? John nodded and made his way out of the classroom. John went into the boys' bathroom and changed out his wet clothes. Then he headed for the exit at the front of the school. When John got outside, the students were already gone. His house wasn't very far, so John was prepared to walk home. On his way out of the school, he ran into Chris. Chris was sitting on the ground against the wall. Chris hadn't noticed John, but when John tried to walk past, Chris stopped him. Hey, John. John looked over at Chris. Yeah? Chris stood up and walked over to him. John was confused. What's up? Chris frowned. How come you didn't defend Sarah and Lisa like you did the other day? John was surprised, but more importantly, he tried to gauge the situation. Was Chris trying to start a fight? Ethan obviously just wants attention, but why give it to him? Eventually, he'll realize his ways will only leave him by himself. John said, a little hesitant and careful about his choice of words. Chris looked at him for a moment, and eventually his frown became a smile of admiration. You know, I can respect that. It's not really your business anyway. John was relieved and surprised. I only got involved because what he did was unacceptable, Chris said. John nodded. I wish she would have kept her mouth shut, John said. Chris nodded. Yeah, but I can't watch a man put his hands on a woman. He didn't touch her, but throwing food on her, to me, holds the same grounds. One minute you're throwing food, and the next you're throwing fists. John nodded. I agree with that. Lisa's kind of stuck up, so I kind of just unconsciously chose to stay out of it. Chris laughed. Rich girl stigma. This made John laugh. Hey, John, are you trying to hang out? John hesitated, but didn't see anything wrong with it. Sure. You want to come to my house and play some games? John asked. Chris nodded. Yeah, although you're probably not as good as me. John scoffed. You want to bet? Chris laughed. Lead the way. They both went to John's house and played games till the sunset.